There are so many interesting questions to ask about alternative medicine beyond just does it work? There's all these interesting histories, there's all these different interesting things going on in the culture and philosophies people are cultivating and sharing. And so I try to get people really excited about that. And then usually in the end, the students are always like, okay, but does it work? Welcome to Preaching to the Comments, a podcast where Princeton scholars answer the internet's burning questions. We saw a post on Reddit that was upvoted almost 3,000 times, and this post said, "There's no such thing as alternative medicine because if it worked, it would just be medicine." And as people who study medicine from different lenses, we have a lot of thoughts.
By definition, I begin, alternative medicine, I continue, has either not been proved to work or been proved not to work. Do you know what they call alternative medicine that's been proved to work? Medicine.
Today, I'm Xita, and I'm a writer. I've worked a lot with patients who have dementia, different kinds of dementia, doctors who treat neurological disabilities, and generally I'm really interested in these kinds of crossovers between literature, medicine, sciences, arts, so I'm excited to be here.
Hi, I'm Liya. I'm a PhD candidate in history at Princeton. I study Eastern medicine and spirituality in 19th and 20th centuries in Russia and beyond. I'm interested in how medicine as a category intersected with religion and how healing practices changed over time.
And I'm Rachel, and I study the relationship between modern spirituality and wellness culture. We wanted to start with an example so that we're not just sort of abstractly talking about alternative medicine. And the first example that came to mind for us was the most recent season of The White Lotus, in which the owner, who's a Thai woman named Sritala, is described as a pioneer in the wellness space. She explains to the guests that she has an autoimmune disease, and because of that, she learned a lot about health and wellness and developed this wellness program at her hotel.
Xita is very famous here in Thailand. Also a pioneer in the wellness space.
Really?
Yeah.
I have autoimmune disease. So I learned all about health and wellness. I even wrote books.
What's going on here? What is alternative medicine? And does alternative medicine as a designation refer to medicine that does not work?
Yeah, so the question being asked here concerns the definition of medicine, right? And the quick answer is it's alternative to biomedicine. But what is biomedicine, you may wonder? The standard definition is that it's a branch of medical science that applies biological and physiological principles to clinical practice. This means that biomedicine focuses on understanding the biological mechanisms underlying diseases rather than mechanisms that are outside the human body. For example, how evil spirits could cause illnesses. And biomedicine uses this knowledge of biological mechanisms to develop targeted treatments that are standardized and evidence-based. Biomedical practitioners would use drugs, radiation, surgery, vaccines, and medical devices like MRI or CT scans. Biomedicine is also known as Western medicine, conventional medicine, or mainstream medicine. In the 19th century, it was also called allopathic medicine, but it was kind of a derogatory term used by homeopaths. So this shows that what was mainstream in the 19th century is not necessarily the case nowadays. And once biomedicine achieved this mainstream status toward the end of the 19th century, everything else just became alternative. So alternative medicine became a term that biomedicine used to signify the opponents, so to speak.
A question I have is this post on Reddit was upvoted almost 3,000 times. So a lot of people think it's a great, insightful comment. And then some of the comments note that it is originally a Tim Minchin quote, who's a comic who has this spoken word poem about meeting a woman who's into alternative medicine and how he thinks she's, very stupid.
Look, Storm, sorry, I don't mean to bore you, but there's no such thing as an aura. Reading auras is like reading minds, or tea leaves, or star signs, or meridian lines. These people aren't plying a skill. They're either lying or mentally ill.
For somebody like me, if I study literature, I'm
Mhm.
interested in medicine, but it's really not my expertise at all. How would you explain to me, for instance, that it's just not the case that alternative medicine is just BS? That there's more nuance to it, and in that, why is this approach simplistic, let's say?
Mhm.
Yeah, from my point of view, it boils down to the question of, how you make truth claims and what is true.
Yeah.
And I think what you're presenting is some kind of binary model, right? It's either this or that, and there's no overlap between the two. But if you look at this question from a historical point of view,
Yeah.
then you see that what counts as medicine changed throughout time. And actually, what this person assumes to be medicine, let's say scientific medicine or biomedicine,
Yeah.
expanded, right, and absorbed a lot of the alternative treatments into its corpus of standardized treatment because people just didn't know how it worked exactly, but through tests in the lab and all kinds of rigorous procedures, they figure out that, oh, actually, this is a good medicine for, these symptoms. So I think in a way, the way this question is framed reflects how we're trying to present a static understanding of,
Yeah.
what medicine is, and it's not changing over time. And also it's binary oppositional terms. Yeah.
Yeah. So, can I quickly ask either of you, but I feel like Liya, you've worked with this history. When we talk about alternative medicine, do you think that another approach, another understanding to medicine and healing has been, let's say in Western societies, has been totally relegated to what we're calling alternative medicine or pseudo medicine? And if not, or maybe Rachel, you're the person to ask, where does one find that? Because as somebody who has spent a lot of time with patients and doctors treating neurological conditions and neurological decline, it is often the case that you have to resort to let's say, standardized, non-traditional medical practices simply because they're not invented yet. Neurological conditions, I think, are so complex still to understand. There's a lot of research, but at the same time, sometimes this research, it kind of misses the emotional or the lifestyle side of these conditions and these patients who have to live with these illnesses. So I would ask both of you, I'd be interested to know your thoughts on that.
So I think it's really interesting. One thing you're pointing out is that when we hear the phrase alternative medicine, often we're thinking about people choosing something in place of biomedicine. So they could take a biomedical approach, but they're choosing something outside of biomedicine instead. And that's sort of where we have this term alternative. It's an alternative to biomedicine. But what you're bringing up, Chita, which also relates to the White Lotus example, because you were talking about people dealing with cognitive decline and dementia, and Sritala in the White Lotus is talking about having an autoimmune disease. These are things that biomedicine cannot cure. So when these people are looking to alternative medicine, it's not because they're rejecting biomedicine, it's because biomedicine can't address their issues. And so then they're turning to different ways of thinking about health and healing. I don't know if you have comments as well, Liya, but Chita, I was wondering if you have any sort of example story you could tell us about your research or writing on dementia and cognitive decline.
Yeah. I have so many stories of in caregiving scenarios, which is what I'm mostly interested in, where you will see someone with cognitive decline trying to ask for something or trying to express something. And if the caregiver who is with them at that moment does not have the tools where it's intelligible to them, then you have to interpret someone's behavior and needs in the same way that you would interpret a painting or a short story or a piece of music. It's the person is not as transparent anymore, but we are complex and we can learn to interpret each other. I feel like that's an example of a different type of care that probably derives from a different understanding of what healing should be and what medicine can be if it doesn't always privilege everything we're saying.
Yeah. Uh, Leah, you, I think, had some interesting points to make about the sort of assumptions that are inherent in the biomedical paradigm. Are those, and how does that kind of relate to what Chita is saying about seeing someone who's dealing with an illness in a different way than maybe a sort of biomedical researcher would see them?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So basically, modern biomedicine or scientific medicine adheres to three assumptions. First is a belief in mind body dualism, which is pretty straightforward. It means that the mind and the body are two separate and distinct entities. Second, biomedicine emphasizes objective numerical measurements and probabilistic reasoning. So, all these devices that we have developed help us diagnose patients and get a sense of what's going on in their body. Whereas more traditional forms of medicine, they use other systems to find out what's going on in your body. So, for example, Chinese medicine doctors would trace the flow of vital energy or qi in invisible channels known as meridians. And so it's kind of about the movement of the energy within your body instead of a localized understanding of what's going on here in your body. And then third is this idea that a disease is a distinct entity separate from the person. It's an external thing that invades and afflicts the body, whereas many alternative medicine systems, they view the disease not as a separate thing out there, but rather a disorder of the body's normal functions.
What would, if I can ask either of you, what would you say though to someone who has watched, for instance, The White Lotus, where some, I would say, alternative medicine or spiritual healing practices, it's true that they are represented as this, mocking them in a way, right? Or calling attention by the cinematography, the script, the characters, all of it, calling attention to how quote unquote alternative medicine or healing practices can sometimes be another word or code for or cover for people who have a lot of money and who want to do things a little differently and a little extravagantly. Maybe that's what anyone who's listening to us who's watched The White Lotus, I'm sure they could sense this while watching the show. So could we talk a little bit about that? Because I think the Reddit post is coming from a prejudice in a way. But if that prejudice is also reinforced by the kind of popular culture that we all watch, can we talk a little bit about that? Or
Yeah, can I jump in on this one? I think part of what you're noting, Chicha, is the rise of the wellness industry.
okay.
And so often these days, alternative medicine is happening within the framework of the wellness industry.
Mm.
And so it's often very expensive and it's often only accessible to people who have a lot of money. I was wondering, Leah, if you would be able to give us more context historically, because I would imagine before the wellness industry becomes this multi-billion dollar international industry, that alternative medicine was probably much more accessible to people who don't have many resources.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I would say that if you look at historical cases in the European context, right, Medicine that we now label as quote unquote alternative or even pseudoscientific, say mesmerism in the 18th century or homeopathy in the 19th century, in these cases, actually, the main clientele was the elites and the urban middle classes. And in homeopathy's case, it had high profile aristocratic patrons, which boosted its legitimacy. And so it's interesting to see a continuity of how these quote unquote alternative treatments can appeal to people who suffered from chronic conditions that conventional medicine could not cure, and those with money and time to experiment with these alternative treatments. But then for the rural population, in a way, quote unquote alternative medicine was just everyday reality because they did not have access to the so called cultured medicine. And this was the 19th century language. Um, and it was equivalent to scientific medicine. And so they just had to try whatever they could in their own villages, seek help from folk healers or just some neighbors who told them that, oh, I've tried this, this works. Why don't you try as well? And in the case of ethnic minorities living in empires, we may even argue that from their point of view, scientific medicine was the quote unquote alternative medicine because it was beyond what they had known before. It's the quintessential other. Um, and I know, Rachel, you're an expert on contemporary wellness industry, and I'm sure this kind of class dimension shows up a lot in your research. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the wellness industry, it's interesting because I see a lot of commentary saying that wellness is about the individual and wellness is about spending money. The idea of wellness is not inherently about individualism and capitalism. The concept of wellness is actually pretty new, and in our modern usage of the term wellness only comes about in the latter half of the 20th century. So previously, there's very few uses of the term wellness, and if it's being used, it's sort of to indicate that, there's a lack of disease or the disease has been cured. So this concept we have now of wellness only comes up really in the latter half of the 20th century, and it emerges alongside the concept of holistic health. So holistic health and wellness are very interlinked. And the idea within both of these is that these concepts arise because many people feel that there's something lacking in modern biomedicine, which is, I would say, there's two central things that people saw lacking in modern biomedicine. One is that it only deals with the body and the physical, but beyond that, that it's very reductive. So people who were developing these paradigms of holistic health and wellness saw biomedicine as reductive in two ways. One, that it reduces the human being to only biology and doesn't account for things like mind or spirit. And two, that within the framework of reducing the human being to biology, biomedicine breaks the human body apart into small pieces, right? So you would go to a different doctor for your foot than for your knee, rather than looking at the human body holistically. So the concept of holistic health is we want to look at the body as a whole, but then even beyond that, we want to look at the person as a whole as more than just a physical body. And another thing that the concepts of holistic health and wellness have in mind is I think their second critique of biomedicine is that it's only focused on the elimination of disease. And
Yeah.
frameworks of holistic health and wellness are saying we don't just want to eliminate a disease when it comes up, which is what biomedicine can do fairly well. We want to also seek health in our lives in other ways beyond just being free of disease. And so that isn't inherently individualistic or capitalistic. But it gets taken up in those frameworks because these concepts are rising historically in the same moment that late capitalism is really taking off, right?
Yeah.
So the wellness industry develops, but you can use the concepts, the sort of central concepts from holistic health and wellness movements to think about the holistic health of our society, the wellness of people who, you know, don't have structural access to good food or mental health care.
I am super interested in what you're saying, Rachel, particularly when you talk about how the focus is on, and maybe Leah, you were talking about this as well. If the focus is on eliminating the disease, what are we doing with a lot of people in our society who have a disease or a condition that you cannot get rid of because it's new, say it's degenerative, right? It's a classic Susan Sontag idea of if you treat illness as though it's a battle, and if you use this language of killing it, but people have to live with it, why don't you switch the language? Why don't you switch the paradigm and focus as well on living with illness as opposed to getting rid of it when you can't get rid of it? There's something called art therapy, music therapy for patients with dementia. This is kind of shocking to see, particularly music. The moment you play some music, start experimenting with music with them, things about their memories, about their personalities, about their secrets, about their gestures, about their life, and about the narrative of their life start opening up in ways that, everyone around them, the family, the caregivers, the doctors were so quote unquote frustrated that quote unquote they weren't themselves anymore. So I think these kind of therapies, I think maybe touch on what you were saying, Rachel, treating the person as this whole, as opposed to trying to break it apart as a machine that can be dealt with in parts, which would be more of a Cartesian model, where you can totally separate mind from body, and consequentially, you separate your body from other bodies. We're all connected. The body and the mind and the spirit are connected. And I think in terms of medicine, we even see this in the Hippocratic writings, where I don't think the person is even treated only as a patient, right? And I forget the exact language, but there's something there about how the person is a hieroglyphic or something to be really
Interpreted.
interpreted, attentive to, not solved, and not ultimately cured. And in the Hippocratic writings, you also have this notion of no one is actually fully healthy. In the same way that if you have an illness, you're not just that illness, and you need to be dealt with.
Yeah, I think, Chita, you make a really good point about how this is not just about medicine. It's about our society in this particular moment of history when we have really sophisticated knowledge about something very niche and specialized, either it's in natural sciences or in medicine, right? And in order to become a really good surgeon, you need to spend years in medical school to study and understand how particular parts of the body work. But then when you're treating the patient, right, they're not just, say, this arm or this leg, they're a whole person. I think when we tend to see illness or patients as just something external and these objects that need to be studied, then we lose this humanistic touch.
Yeah. I study religion. Religious studies is a framework for looking at things, ideas, philosophies, beliefs, practices that don't fit quite into the modern secular scientific world or worldview. So sometimes maybe alternative medicine could be, okay, the biomedical doctor is wanting you to take a pharmaceutical drug, and the alternative medicine person is wanting you to take, some sort of herb instead, right? That would be a way of treating a health problem that is philosophically quite similar. So, in both cases, we're thinking about putting a physical thing into the physical body in order to heal something or solve a problem. But Even more often, alternative medicine is not just saying, here's a different thing you could take instead of whatever mainstream doctors want you to take. It often is about an entirely different philosophy of health and healing. And these different philosophies of health and healing are rooted in different philosophies of what it means to be human and who the human being fundamentally is. We often see ways of thinking about human health and wellness that seem sort of spiritual or religious, primarily because they have a definition of the person that exceeds the material and the physical. So you're mentioning that medicine can be a scientific endeavor, it can also be an artistic endeavor. Is there a sense in what gets counted as straight up medicine instead of alternative medicine? That it has to be rooted in science? And is there anything lacking if we see science as the only approach for making sense of human health and wellness?
Yeah, I think, Rachel, you made a really good point. How a lot of people who say we believe in science, it kind of becomes something like scientism rather than science,
Mm.
which is just a way of looking at the world, or, the way you think about how a method, yeah, how you should study something, produce knowledge into something that is just like faith and very rigid. And that's the only source of truth. And therefore, you enter into a kind of antagonistic relationship with other people. But if you think of science just as a method, which involves empiricism, experiments that could be repeated, and just be open to things could be otherwise. If you can
Mm.
show me that an experiment is run in a different way, so I think here it can be a slippery slope when you say, I believe in science. And if you look at 19th century debates about what medicine is and its relationship to science, many doctors actually were saying that medicine shares a lot of overlap with science in its method. But at the same time, medicine is a form of art, is the way you talk to the patient, is the way you try to understand what's ailing them, right? How they describe the symptoms. Can you trust what they're saying? You can compare what an MRI machine or blood test is telling you, but if patient is telling you something else, what do you do with that information? And there, sometimes scientific method doesn't give you enough toolkit to
Mm.
interpret that information, right? Kind of a common example is people or patients who suffer from chronic pain, and let's say they run all these tests. Their blood test is normal, and doctors just can't find anything wrong in their body from this biomedical point of view. But patients are telling you that I have pain here, or I'm feeling this and that. So what do you do in this case? If you're a doctor, I think this is where the humanistic side is really important in the medical education as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a good question. When I was teaching with others this course at Princeton, medicine and literature, we were going back and forth. This was the question. And we were going back and forth between, medical papers and medical monographs and short stories by Chekhov, who was a doctor and a writer. And our conclusions were often, well, in a short story or in a narrative, you are able to see, you're able to respond to questions that sometimes science cannot answer. It can ask them and it can have the illusion that it answers them in a holistic way, as you're saying, but it doesn't. So I think that's why other, you know, forms of human expression exist. I think they're complementary. And I think both art and science are asking the same questions, but you cannot have one without the other because it's the same question. It's the core questions, I think, about human life and death with answers that are not exclusive and that you need both.
My sense is that when doctors try to diagnose patients, right, they're basically collecting information about their symptoms, and then they try to decide what is this illness. And so, they will retrieve from their memory what they've studied in the med school. Like if you have combination of ABC, then it's this disease. If not, it's something else. And so they're doing basically some kind of categorization and pattern matching. But then when you apply this approach to mental illnesses, for example, say using DSM-5, there might be a lot of gray areas, and this is when doctors have to rely on other toolkits to form their diagnosis.
Maybe I want to say, just in response to what Liya just said, and we mentioned it when we were talking before, there's this notion, this concept of the tyranny of diagnosis. It's the academic term for something that's, I think, pretty commonsensical, which is a diagnostic notion of medicine and healing is essentially reductive because it transforms a complex phenomenon and a person into a disease in a way that when you have scenarios like a misdiagnosis, it's really hard then to reconfigure.
Okay, so we've talked a lot now about what we think about this Reddit post. If you guys were going to leave one comment on this thread on Reddit, what would you want to say? What would you want to add to this conversation?
Yeah, I would just say that I think we should have a more expansive understanding of medicine, health, and healing beyond this antagonistic binary of biomedicine and alternative medicine. Instead, it would be more productive to think about how different forms of healing practices could complement each other and improve one's well being overall. Because biomedicine cannot solve all problems, and it is probably unfair to have physicians be responsible for every aspect of our well being in the first place, we should incorporate other perspectives on the art of healing from literature, religious studies, history, and other humanistic disciplines. And I believe this is what we as humanists bring into this conversation.
Yeah, I think I would add something a bit similar to what you're saying, Leah. I think if I could add one short comment in response to this Reddit post that alternative medicine doesn't exist because if it worked, it would just be medicine. I think we should broaden this binary between medicine and alternative medicine because even in many biomedical hospitals today, treatments that might be considered alternative, things like, energy healing or Reiki, will often be offered within a mainstream biomedical hospital context. And a lot of times, these sorts of non biomedical treatments are referred to as complementary medicine. And increasingly, I'm seeing the phrase integrative medicine. And again, many mainstream biomedical facilities are labeling their services as integrative, meaning that they use biomedicine and they also use what might be called alternative medicine practices. So, just to note to this Reddit user that there's not necessarily a strong distinction between scientists and medical providers focusing just on biomedicine and people who don't understand science focusing on alternative medicine. In practice, there's actually a lot of overlap and mutual interest between the two.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's fair to say the way the Reddit post is framed, it's pointing at a semantic problem, right? Because not a real problem, so to speak, because as we've been talking about, medicine can be many things and pharmacological and therapeutic approaches can be combined. So not to totally dismiss it, but I think the way it's framed, it can be simplistic or it's pointing at a problem in language and how we understand what medicine is. And I hope that we've managed to broaden the concept for listeners.
And in conclusion, we should also note for our listeners that we are not medical doctors, we're doctors of philosophy. So don't come to this episode for your medical emergencies, but if you're having an emergency in thinking philosophically about medicine, we can help with that.
This podcast is produced by the media team at the Center for Culture, Society, and Religion at Princeton University. For any other information or for transcripts, please visit our website.